Me tell you something. If you want to know what it's like to live under the iron fist of a truly petty dictator, forget North Korea. Come to suburban America. Come to pristine Pines, where the hedges are trimmed, the lawns are uniformly green, and the official community leader is a woman whose heart is 2 sizes too small and made entirely of concrete. Mrs. Henderson. My name is Alex. I'm just a guy who likes his smart home to be, well, smart and comfortable. Apparently, comfort is a capital offense around here. The whole thing started, as most epic suburban wars do, with a piece of paper in my mailbox. A crisp, cream-colored envelope bearing the crest of the Pristine Pines Homeowners Association, a crest that, I swear, looks like a tiny hand giving you the finger. I opened it over my morning coffee, expecting the usual nonsense about acceptable mailbox fonts or the precise day my garbage can could be visible from space. What I got was a declaration of war against my digital doorbell. The letter, which I still have framed in my garage as a testament to human stupidity, cited Article 4, Section 4B, subsection 17, which governs the maximum permissible sound emissions for non-emergency external audible signaling devices. Yes, really. My doorbell, the one that played a cheerful, slightly synthesized tada, was allegedly operating at 83 decibels. The limit, according to the Pristine Pines Code of Auditory Decorum, was 80 dB. I was a full 3 decibels above the line. I was essentially running a rave on my porch. My first thought? They must have used a faulty sound meter. My second thought? This is Mrs. Henderson. She probably sleeps with a decibel meter under her pillow, ready to spring into action if a caterpillar sneezes too loudly. I called her. Big mistake. Huge. Mrs. Henderson, are you seriously telling me that 3 decibels, the difference between a whisper and a gentle breeze, is enough to violate my homeowner rights? I asked, trying to keep the sarcasm in check, but failing miserably. Her voice, predictably, was like gravel mixed with chilled arsenic. Mr. Thorne, the bylaws are not advisory, they are binding. As president of the association, it is my duty to ensure acoustic harmony. Your device, sir, is an acoustical aggressor. Acoustical aggressor. I almost choked on my espresso. It's a $10 doorbell, Carol. My Roomba makes more noise. Its volume is irrelevant to the regulation, she chirped. The sound profile is specifically calibrated to induce anxiety and distress in the surrounding environment. You have 24 hours to deactivate the offending noise source, or the daily fine of $100 will commence. I tried the rational route, which is like trying to reason with a brick wall after it's been elected mayor. Look, I can turn the volume down through the app. I'll make it whisper. The device, she stated, emphasizing the word like it was a contraband grenade, must be deactivated. The notification itself has created a precedent of auditory trespass within the community. Auditory trespass! That's it. I'm done. You know what? Fine. I'll deactivate the damn thing. I hung up before she could hit me with another vocabulary word from her petty tyrant's thesaurus. And I did it. I went outside, pulled the little digital puck off the wall, and threw it in the junk drawer. I sat back in my living room, staring at the empty circle of paint where the doorbell used to be. The silence was deafening. It was the sound of a small, mean victory for Mrs. Henderson. My house was officially a tomb. If the FedEx guy needed to drop off a critically important package, he'd have to perform a silent, respectful tap dance on the patio. I was seething. I wanted to scream. I wanted to build a siren on my roof that played the theme song from The Godfather at 150 decibels every time a cloud passed over. but I couldn't. The rules. The damned idiotic rules. Wait, the rules. I reread the offending section on my laptop, pulling up the PDF copy of the bylaws. Maximum permissible sound emissions for non-emergency external audible signaling devices. Devices. That word shimmered on the screen like a beacon of glorious, expensive defiance. My doorbell was a device. The chime was a sound emission. But what about an organic, carbon-based life form? What about me? Or better yet, someone I paid to yell for me? A slow, evil grin spread across my face. If I couldn't use an electronic device to announce guests, I could use a human. And if I was going to employ a human to shout at the neighbors, I wasn't going to hire a guy in a hoodie. This was no longer about a doorbell. This was about principle. This was about class. This was about sending Mrs. Henderson a message written in gold-stitched velvet. I opened a new browser tab. That's when I Googled professional butler services, immediate hire, no questions asked, must wear white gloves. The executive search for my estate announcer was, without a doubt, the most bizarre human resources process ever conducted in a 3-bedroom ranch. Most butler services assumed I had a yacht, a manor house, or at least a separate wing for the staff. When I explained the job, literally standing by the front door and yelling at people, they either laughed or quoted me a price so astronomical I considered just paying Mrs. Henderson the fine. The applications were pure gold. One resume started with, I served the Archduke of Liechtenstein's second cousin, thrice removed. Another guy, a self-proclaimed lifestyle manager, informed me in the interview that he could handle my entire portfolio, but only if I agreed to switch from single malt Scotch to a triple distilled Japanese whiskey. Sir, he sniffed, adjusting a tiny, circular pair of glasses, your current brand is simply too loud. Oh, the irony. Then there was the French gentleman who showed up in a beret, carrying a feather duster. He didn't speak a lick of English. I asked him if he understood the job was essentially to be a human foghorn. He just shrugged and said, Oui, in a tone that suggested all problems could be solved with a good cheese plate. It was starting to look hopeless. I needed someone dignified enough to infuriate Mrs. Henderson, yet composed enough not to quit after the first encounter. I needed a man who understood the difference between a job and a calling. And then, there he was. His name was Reginald. He arrived precisely at 3:00 p.m., not a minute early, not a minute late. He was in a bespoke black suit, black gloves, and a shirt so white it practically glowed with moral superiority. He didn't knock because, well, I had no doorbell. He just waited, perfectly still, until I opened the door. I invited him into my very average, slightly messy living room, which instantly seemed smaller and dirtier just by his presence. Mr. Thorne, he said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. Thank you for the interview opportunity. I have reviewed the job description, and I must admit, it presents a unique engagement. Unique is one word for it, I muttered, leaning back on my sofa. Let's be clear, Reginald. This is not about cleaning silver or managing a wine cellar. This is about spite. Pure, unadulterated, contractual spite. I need you to stand by this door, I pointed at the frame. And when someone approaches, I need you to announce them, loudly, with maximum formality, for the sole purpose of annoying my HOA president, Mrs. Henderson. Reginald nodded slowly, his face utterly blank. He was processing this information like a high-powered mainframe. My first question, sir, he finally stated, is regarding the volume requirement. Is the objective clarity of announcement or projection of sound intended to supersede the HOA's previous ruling on acoustic emissions? I was impressed. He was speaking the language of the enemy. Both, I said, grinning. I want clarity, but I want it to echo across the cul-de-sac. I want the sound of your voice to cause Mrs. Henderson's teeth to clench involuntarily. But legally, I need your volume to be categorized as articulated speech, not noise pollution. Sir, ensuring a proper oral welcome, regardless of its volume, is the very bedrock of household management, Reginald replied, without blinking. The challenge lies only in the presentation. I asked him the skeptical question that was burning in my mind. Are you absolutely sure this is a good use of your masters in etiquette? My degree, sir, he replied, folding his hands perfectly, is in the efficient application of decorum. It matters little whether the venue is Buckingham Palace or indeed pristine Pines. A rule has been weaponized. It is my duty to provide a countermeasure of equal yet lawful absurdity. He was perfect. He was a ninja of formality. We moved on to the contract. It was 8 pages long. He didn't require a wine cellar, but he did require an official, custom-tailored uniform to be pressed daily, a specific, non-tarnishing silver tray for keys, small notes, or, as he put it, emergency mints. A minimum of 3 15-minute scheduled tea breaks per day to be taken in the garden, regardless of weather. A starting salary. The number was large. Let's just say that the original smart doorbell cost me $129. The Reginald solution was going to cost me $80,000 a year, plus uniforms and mints. I signed it anyway. I justified the cost to myself with maximum sarcasm. It's not defiance, it's property maintenance. It's a preventative measure against future psychological distress caused by excessive bureaucracy. It's deductible, probably. As he prepared to get into his car to retrieve his effects, he had one last, crucial question. Sir, a logistical matter. Should a food delivery service arrive, specifically a purveyor of the common savory pie, what is the prescribed level of formality for the announcement? I spent the next 20 minutes debating the appropriate script. Should it be, the delivery agent for the Domino's Corporation has arrived with your order of comestibles, or something punchier? We settled on, Reginald, clear your throat. Announce, the representative from the pizzeria has completed his mission. Reginald nodded, his face confirming that this was a satisfactory directive. He was hired, paid, and stationed by the door, ready for the inaugural announcement. The war of the chime was officially escalating to the war of the man in the tuxedo. The next day, Reginald was in position. He stood just inside the porch overhang, back perfectly straight, hands clasped behind him. He looked less like a butler and more like a very confused Secret Service agent protecting a potted fern. I watched him from the couch, grinning like a fool. The first victim was a hapless Amazon driver named Kevin, judging by the name tag. Kevin parked, grabbed a huge, bulky box. It was the new ergonomic footrest I'd stress-bought, and trudged up the walk. He reached the door and, instinctively, went to push the non-existent button. He stopped, confused. That was Reginald's cue. He took one step forward, straightened his spine, and projected his voice, a perfect booming bass that carried easily across the now silent street. Hark! A gentleman of the Amazonian order has arrived with a package of significance for Mr. Thorney. I swear, I heard Kevin drop the box. He jumped back a full foot, clutching his heart. He stared at Reginald, then back at his van, then back at Reginald. The man in the tuxedo simply pointed at the designated drop spot with a white-gloved hand. Delivery confirmed, sir. Have a splendid afternoon. I was wheezing with laughter on the couch. Kevin didn't even wait for a signature. He just bolted back to his vehicle, convinced he'd stumbled onto a very exclusive, very weird cult. The neighborhood's reaction was immediate and beautiful. Suddenly, people were driving slower. I watched Mrs. Stevens, 2 houses down, drive past 3 times, her cell phone held up like she was trying to film a UFO. Mr. Peterson, who hasn't spoken a word to me since I parked my pickup on the curb for 20 minutes back in 2019, stopped to trim a low-hanging branch for a full half hour, just to steal glances at the man guarding my front door. The true test, however, came with the arrival of my friend, Barry. Barry is pure, unfiltered American chaos. He doesn't knock. He air horns. Barry pulls up in his rusty Mustang, jumps out, and makes a beeline for the door. He freezes mid-step. He sees Reginald. Reginald sees him. "Good afternoon, sir," Reginald intoned, with just enough volume to rattle the glass on the storm door. "Might I have the pleasure of announcing your presence?" Barry just stood there, jaw slightly ajar, holding a 6-pack of craft beer. Who are you?" Reginald didn't answer the question. He answered the protocol. "Kindly state your name, sir, that I may execute the appropriate oral welcome from Mr. Thorne." I decided this was my cue. I opened the door. "Barry, get in here, man. Don't be shy. Reginald is just doing his job." Barry stumbled past the butler, into my house. He looked at me like I'd finally lost it. "Dude, is this legal?" Barry whispered, eyes wide, gesturing back at the imposing figure now closing the door with a gentle thunk. "Your doorbell used to play Smooth Operator. Now it's an opera. That guy just announced me like I was invading Poland. What did he call me?" I believe the phrase was, "A gentleman of dubious attire and delightful temperament has arrived. Please commence the dispensing of beverages," I informed him, grabbing the 6-pack. And yes, it's legal. Perfectly, exquisitely legal. The real fun started about an hour later. I was explaining the glorious legal loophole to Barry when Reginald stepped into the living room, holding the silver tray, upon which sat a single, neatly folded note. "Sir, may I interrupt? A party is approaching the premises with an air of severe administrative intent. I detect the unmistakable scent of a grievance." I peeked out the window. Sure enough, it was Mrs. Henderson, dressed in a power khaki outfit, clipboard held like a shield, and a frown that could curdle milk. She was clearly expecting to find a hidden speaker playing a loop of doorbell sounds. "Showtime, Barry," I said, adjusting my posture on the couch. She marched right up to the door, and seeing no button, raised her fist to knock. Reginald stepped out, blocking the door with his own immaculate person. "Madam," he said, his voice firm but polite, "welcome to the residence of Mr. Alex Thorne. I am Reginald, a duly contracted estate announcer. Might I inquire if you have an appointment, or are you delivering a certified communication?" Mrs. Henderson's face went through 5 stages of grief in 2 seconds. Confusion, rage, recognition, utter horror, and finally, pure administrative fury. "What in God's name is this spectacle?" she shrieked, clutching her clipboard. "It is the efficient management of guest flow, madam, which, as I'm sure you're aware, has become necessary due to the unfortunate decommissioning of Mr. Thorne's electronic signaling device," Reginald replied, calm as a glacier. I slid the storm door open and leaned out. "Oh, hey, Carol, nice outfit. You look ready to audit a tax return. Did you forget your key? Reginald is our new notification system. Isn't he wonderfully expressive?" Mrs. Henderson sputtered. You cannot be serious. This is a deliberate mockery of the bylaws. This falls under general public nuisance, Section A." "Ah, general public nuisance," I countered, leaning against the doorframe. "Let's review the definition, shall we? Any activity that emits noise, odor, or visual disruption deemed excessive by the governing board. Noise? Reginald's voice is legally articulated speech, Carol, not a device emission. Odor? Reginald smells faintly of sandalwood and expensive soap. Visual disruption? That man is wearing a perfectly tailored tuxedo. Is the HOA now attempting to regulate the aesthetics of a W-2 employee?" I was quoting the bylaws back at her, confirming that Reginald was a person, not a device, and thus not regulated by Section 4B, subsection 17. Her face was truly priceless. It was the face of a villain who realized her meticulously crafted legal plot had been undone by a simple, expensive verb. She pointed a shaking finger at Reginald. "If I hear him shout one more time, I will amend the bylaws to ban, specifically, human announcers." "Then you'd be violating his rights to private employment and freedom of expression, Carol," I said cheerfully. "But please, grab a legal pad and get busy. In the meantime, Reginald stays." She whirled around, stomped off the porch, and marched back to her car, her clipboard nearly shattering under the sheer force of her failure. The butler stays, and the HOA prepares for war. Mrs. Henderson's attempts to retaliate were swift and predictably petty. The first thing she did was install a massive, ugly, official community announcement board right across the street from my house. It was huge, made of cheap composite wood, and painted a truly hideous shade of institutional beige. It looked like a discarded bus shelter. My response was to expand Reginald's duties. "Reginald," I instructed, handing him a high-powered pair of binoculars, "your new mission, should you choose to accept it, is to monitor the bulletin board. I need a detailed log, accurate to the minute, of every time Mrs. Henderson touches it, reads it, or merely glances at it. This is for potential litigation. We must establish a pattern of obsessive board involvement." "Understood, sir," he replied, taking the binoculars. "Should I also log instances of suspicious vehicular activity?" "Only if it involves a beige sedan and a clipboard," I clarified. Next, I decided to exploit another HOA rule. I hired a contractor to perform unnecessary, hyper-specific work on my mailbox. The HOA had a rule about maintenance in progress, allowing equipment to be staged on the lawn for 24 hours a day. I was going to ensure that a hideous contractor van and 2 bags of concrete were permanently blocking Mrs. Henderson's view of my house. This brought me to my next great dialogue opportunity: Gary the Grumpy. Gary arrived in a beat-up Ford van that looked like it had survived 3 wars and a termite infestation. Gary himself was a classic working-class American contractor, sturdy, cynical, wearing a vest stained with various historical colors of paint. He'd dealt with HOAs before, but nothing could have prepared him for Reginald. Gary walked up the driveway, saw Reginald, stopped dead, and stared. Reginald performed the introduction perfectly. "Good morning, sir. Reginald, estate announcer. Might I present the documents detailing the proposed modification to the terrestrial mail receptacle pedestal?" Gary turned to me, mouth agape. "What in the actual hell? Who is the guy in the penguin suit?" I sauntered out onto the porch. "Gary, meet Reginald. Reginald, meet Gary. Gary is here to perform Phase 1 of the mail receptacle restoration project." "Restoration project?" Gary scoffed, looking at my perfectly adequate mailbox. "You called me because you want this pedestal exactly 42.5 inches high, painted slightly off-white, and you want the base mortared with a specialized, non-shrinking grout. This thing is fine. What's the catch? The catch, Gary, I explained, is that the old pedestal was 42.6 inches. That's outside the allowable deviation of the Pristine Pines Manual of External Fixture Standards, Section C, Part 9. We are ensuring compliance. Reginald will be supervising. Reginald stepped closer, holding the blueprints I'd drawn up on a napkin, which he had somehow laminated. Mr. Gary, Reginald began, without an ounce of irony, the tensile strength of the proposed mortar must accommodate a minimum wind shear of 40 miles per hour. Furthermore, the selection of the slightly off-white hue must adhere to the board-mandated LRV value of 76, which is exactly 2 points lower than chalk white. Do you have the requisite LRV chart? Gary stared at the blueprint, then at Reginald, then back at me. He looked like he was suffering a mental breakdown. I use white paint, man! White paint! And who talks like that? Tensile strength? Is this a mailbox or a space shuttle? Gary threw his hands up. It's an act of defiance, Gary, I translated, laughing. And that man is my lawyer/announcer/existential nightmare. Just tell him yes, and get your big, ugly van parked right in front of the bulletin board. You're getting paid triple time. The dialogue between Gary's blunt American confusion and Reginald's formal British condescension was the focus of the next few days. Reginald, tell him I need the grout by 10 a.m., not 10:05. The morning light hits the mailbox just right then, I commanded from inside. Reginald relayed the message. Mr. Gary, Sir requires the substrate application to be completed prior to the advent of the 10th hour of the morning, as the aesthetic evaluation of the finished product is dependent upon the optimum trajectory of the sun's morning arc. Gary just looked at me. He means he wants it before 10, right? He means exactly that, I confirmed. But Reginald just makes it sound important. Meanwhile, Mrs. Henderson was losing her mind. She tried to issue a violation for the contractor van. Excessive commercial vehicular presence. But I immediately faxed her the section of the bylaws I was exploiting. The temporary scaffolding I had Gary erect around the mailbox was like a personal fortress against her gaze. As a final petty act, I had Reginald practice announcing a mock guest with exaggerated theatrical emphasis. I made him step outside and belt, "Huzzah! A ghost of unknown origin has arrived for midday tea." A neighbor, Mrs. Klein, peeked out her window, clutching her pearl necklace and dialing her priest. The stakes were raised. This spectacle was too much for the HOA to ignore. The battle lines were drawn in mortar and powdered wig. The next step in the inevitable escalation was, naturally, the cops. Mrs. Henderson, having exhausted her bylaw weaponry, moved to the nuclear option, claiming I was disturbing the peace and possibly running a front for a very strange, tuxedo-clad criminal organization. I was having my scheduled mid-morning meeting with Reginald, discussing the proper temperature for my iced tea, when the flashing blue lights appeared. 2 police cruisers pulled up, parking directly in front of Gary's construction van. Perfect. Reginald announced their arrival with professional decorum. "Sir, 2 agents of the local constabulary have arrived. Their intentions appear procedural rather than social." I went to the door. Standing on my lawn were Officer Davis, a jaded veteran who looked like he'd seen one too many neighborhood disputes over pet squirrels, and Officer Miller, a young, nervous rookie. Officer Davis sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Mr. Thorne, we're getting complaints about loud, repetitive shouting and a bizarre social experiment involving a man in formal wear loitering near the curb. "Ah, the man in formal wear," I said, gesturing to Reginald, who was now holding the door ajar, looking utterly composed. "That would be Reginald. He's my employee, a legal, tax-paying W-2 employee. Loitering? Officer, he's performing his contracted duties on private property. That's the opposite of loitering. That's service." Officer Miller, the rookie, couldn't help but stare at Reginald. "Sir, does he shout the time?" "Only if I ask him to, officer. But generally, his job is to announce guests, loudly." Reginald stepped forward. "Officers, may I offer you a refreshment? Mr. Thorne keeps an excellent Earl Grey. Perhaps a calming mint?" Officer Davis held up a hand. "Yes, Reginald, we're not currently accepting tea. Look, Mr. Thorne, the complaint is disturbing the peace. We have a neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, who claims the volume of his announcements is creating a public nuisance." "Disturbing the peace?" I stepped onto the porch. "Let me show you something, officer." I pulled out my phone and played the audio of my old doorbell chime. Ta-da! That was 83 decibels. Illegal, according to the HOA. Now, Reginald, if you would be so kind as to announce Officer Davis's name at a conversational yet clearly projected volume. Reginald cleared his throat. "Officer Davis, your presence has been confirmed." The volume was maybe 75 decibels, loud but clearly articulated speech. The difference was that the words were sharp, formal, and utterly unexpected in a quiet suburban street. "See, officer?" I said, leaning in. "A device makes a noise. A person makes a statement. Mrs. Henderson banned the noise. She did not ban the statement. Section 4B, subsection 17, regulates electronic emissions. It says nothing about the decibel level of a human voice. If I can yell at my kids, I can pay Reginald to yell at my Amazon driver." Officer Davis was a cynical veteran, and I could see the wheels turning. He knew this was a petty dispute, but the legal loophole was beautiful. He looked at Reginald, then at my smug face, and finally at the clipboard-wielding Mrs. Henderson watching us from her porch across the street. "You're paying this man a salary just to announce people?" Officer Davis asked, trying to stifle a smile. "For the dignity of my privacy, officer," I corrected him, "and to uphold the American principle of finding a loophole in every overly bureaucratic regulation ever written. Isn't that what this country is built on?" Reginald, sensing the tone shift, decided to escalate the formality. "Officers, I must insist. The heat is considerable. A cool glass of filtered tap water, perhaps? Mr. Thorne is committed to hydration standards, which I am also contracted to enforce." The officers exchanged a look that said, "I wish I hadn't gone into law enforcement." Officer Davis let out a long breath. "Look, Mr. Thorne, as much as this is a truly magnificent waste of money and human potential, you're not breaking any municipal laws. You're not violating a noise ordinance. He's not a device. He's an employee. The employment arrangement is deeply unsettling, but not criminal." He turned and shouted across the street to Mrs. Henderson, who was now leaning over her azaleas. "Ma'am, we've determined there is no crime. It's a civil matter. Take it up with your HOA board." Mrs. Henderson's scream of frustration was probably louder than my original doorbell. Officer Davis shook his head and got back into his cruiser, leaving Officer Miller standing there, still looking mystified. "So, is he—" Miller started. "He's the best damn doorbell in the state, officer," I finished for him. The police had no jurisdiction. The law was on my side. The only avenue left was the final battle, the HOA board meeting. The Grand Inquisition was inevitable. The monthly HOA meeting was held on the third Tuesday of the month, in the cramped, poorly lit basement of the community clubhouse. It smelled faintly of mildew and passive aggression. This month, however, the room was packed. People I'd never seen before, ghosts of pristine pines, had emerged from their tidy houses, drawn by the legend of the Butler ban. Mrs. Henderson sat at the head table, flanked by the 3 other board members. Jerry, a nervous man who clearly just wanted to talk about irrigation. Ms. Peterson, who was a quiet ally of mine, and Mr. Wallace, who just nodded whenever Mrs. Henderson spoke. The Reginald clause was the only item on the agenda. Mrs. Henderson, dressed in a business suit that looked several sizes too small for the sheer weight of her righteousness, tapped the microphone. The sound squeaked, and she adjusted it with unnecessary violence. "Neighbors," she announced, her voice dripping with solemnity. "We are here tonight to address a malicious, deliberate, and frankly un-American attempt to circumvent the laws of this community. We have witnessed an unprecedented escalation of harassment in the form of a paid, human signaling device." She then presented the proposed amendment to the bylaws. She read it slowly, dramatically, as if reading the preamble to the Constitution. Proposed Amendment 4B17A. No person or persons shall be employed, contracted, or otherwise retained on the premises whose primary function is to serve as an audible signaling device in place of a banned electronic device. Such function constitutes a public nuisance, an abuse of governing statutes, and a clear and present danger to the peace and quiet of pristine pines. She finished, glaring directly at me. Mr. Thorne has weaponized human employment to flout our rules. If this amendment does not pass, we risk a complete breakdown of all community order. My turn. I stood up and walked to the microphone, adopting a faux solemn tone that was 3 times as dramatic as hers. "Fellow homeowners," I began, folding my hands exactly like Reginald did. "I appreciate Mrs. Henderson's passionate, if slightly melodramatic, indictment of my property choices, but tonight we are not voting on a bylaw. We are voting on freedom." I paused for effect. Jerry coughed nervously. "My doorbell was banned. Fine." I paid the fine. I removed the device. I complied. But in a free country, the right to employ whomever I choose to perform whatever task I require, whether it's announcing a guest or, say, monitoring the precise humidity level of my petunias, that is a sacred, constitutional right. You are not just banning Reginald, you are attacking the importance of human labor. I pointed at the amendment. "Mrs. Henderson is proposing we ban a man because he speaks too loudly. This is regulatory overreach. She wants to force me to use an electronic device, which she already banned, instead of a human being. The logic is circular, and frankly, it is un-American." My climax was Reginald's entrance. I had arranged for him to wait outside the basement door. "But don't take my word for it," I declared. "Let's hear from the man whose dignity and livelihood are under attack." I nodded to the door. Reginald pushed it open, stepped into the mildewy basement, and stood perfectly still. The room went silent. "Mr. Reginald," I asked him, "why do you stand at my door?" "I stand at the door, sir," Reginald replied, his voice echoing in the small room, "to serve Mr. Thorne. My contract specifies I am an estate announcer. It is a noble profession, dating back to the earliest manners of the European aristocracy. To ban me is to ban a trade. It is to declare my service undignified." He then focused his gaze entirely on Mrs. Henderson. "Madam President, is your intention to infringe upon my right to a livelihood?" Is the HOA suggesting that my formal, articulate speech is inherently a nuisance, while the sound of a lawnmower, the barking of a dog, or the shriek of a poorly maintained leaf blower, all electronic emissions, mind you, are permitted? The logic bomb was deployed. The board members started whispering nervously. Then Reginald, in a masterstroke of timing, turned to the door behind him, which had just opened slightly. A late-arriving board member, Mr. Harrison, scurried in, looking embarrassed. Reginald raised his voice to full theatrical projection. "Attention! Mr. Harrison, a duly appointed member of the Board of Governors has arrived, delayed by traffic apparently. All rise for Mr. Harrison." The room dissolved into a riot of laughter and procedural chaos. Mr. Wallace and Jerry shot up reflexively, then sat down, mortified. Mrs. Henderson was beetroot red. The debate raged. I had Ms. Peterson on my side, arguing that the amendment was too vague and would open the door to banning gardeners and pool boys. "If we ban Reginald," she argued, "what stops us from banning any employee of a homeowner? This sets a terrible precedent." I stepped in for the final push, pulling out the big guns. "I have just received a call from my lawyer. He informed me that the proposed amendment, being retroactive and targeting an existing lawful employment agreement, would constitute a restrictive covenant violation, potentially opening the HOA to a full-scale discrimination lawsuit from Reginald. The legal fees alone would bankrupt Pristine Pines." That sealed it. Jerry, sweating profusely, suddenly found his spine. The vote was called. Mrs. Henderson, Jerry, Ms. Peterson, and Mr. Wallace. 4 votes. Mrs. Henderson voted yes. Mr. Wallace, terrified of her, yes. Ms. Peterson, my secret ally, no. Jerry, terrified of the lawyer, no. 2 votes to 2. A tie. Mrs. Henderson's face went slack with horror. "A tie vote fails," I announced triumphantly. "The amendment is defeated. Reginald is protected under the law. Dignity is restored." I made my grand exit. I bowed deeply to the assembled homeowners, thanked them for upholding the dignity of the American worker, and Reginald handed me my car keys, which were resting on his silver tray. "Congratulations, sir," Reginald murmured as we walked out. "We won, Reginald," I whispered back. "We won the war against good sense." The war was won. The next morning, Pristine Pines was quieter, but funnier. Mrs. Henderson had been soundly chastened, retreating into a quiet, passive-aggressive rule-making phase. She issued a 10-page memo on acceptable lawn gnome colors and the precise specifications for seasonal doormats. But the terror was gone. She lost the big one. The new normal was the most absurd part. Reginald remained. His job description had expanded, and frankly, my life was better because of it. He announced everything. The daily arrival of the mail carrier. "Sir, the Federal Courier of the Postal Services has deposited your correspondence." The rain. "A considerable descent of atmospheric moisture has commenced, sir. I recommend fetching the decorative umbrella." He even started announcing things that only I could hear. One afternoon, I was staring blankly at the pantry, trying to decide between instant ramen and a can of beans. Reginald materialized beside me. "Reginald, sir, you appear to be pondering the structural integrity of this bagel. May I suggest the low-sodium option to minimize culinary regret?" "How did you know I was thinking about the bagel, Reginald?" "I am contracted to ensure efficiency, sir. Indecision is inefficient. My neighbors, inspired by my victory, started petty rebellions of their own. Mr. Peterson, who had always been Mrs. Henderson's most dedicated informant, installed a huge, ugly, Gothic fountain in his yard, well within code, but aggressively distasteful. Another neighbor hired a gardener, whose sole job was to trim one specific ornamental bush every day for exactly 6 minutes. The community was slightly more fun and much less pristine. Pristine pines had been liberated by a man in a tuxedo. A few weeks later, a black sedan pulled up to the curb. It wasn't the police. It was a sleek, professional vehicle. Reginald stepped out and marched up to the driver's window. A woman with a confident, sharp look leaned out. Reginald returned to the door and announced with maximum volume, "Huzza, sir! A journalist from the Washington Post has arrived. She wishes to interview you regarding your role as a champion of HOA liberation and the establishment of the regularly announced guest." I grinned. My $20 rebellion had become a national story. "Show her in, Reginald," I said, straightening my shirt. "But first, ask her if she prefers sparkling or still water." The fine was $100 a day. Over a month, that would have been $3,000. Reginald costs me $80,000 a year, plus mints, tea, and dry cleaning. But you know what? Worth every single penny.